So let's talk about friction hitches for mountaineering. Let's dive in. So hello and welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here then make sure you head down there and hit that subscribe button. That way you're not going to miss out on any of my future videos. If you don't know who I am, my name's Searle and I'm an IFMGA guide based out in Chamonix, France. So before we get stuck into this video, it's worth noting that the world of friction hitches is vast and deep. There's loads and loads of different friction hitches out there, but in the context of climbing and mountaineering, I don't think we need to know that many different types of friction hitches, but it is worth knowing a few of the common ones, how to tie them, their limitations, and also understanding a few different more specialist hitches for more specialist purposes. I'm not a tree guy, I'm not a tree climber. I love trees and I would love to climb some more trees, but I'm not an arborist, so I'm not using friction hitches in that way. I am using friction hitches for mountaineering and for climbing and for ski touring, ski mountaineering, things like that. So this video is very much focused on using friction hitches in that context. So first off, what is a friction hitch and why do we call it a hitch, not a knot, and all that kind of stuff? So a friction hitch is something that we use to get traction onto a rope, whether that rope's under tension or not. And it's called a hitch because it's formed around the rope. If the rope wasn't there, it wouldn't really be anything, so therefore it's not a knot, it's a hitch. So what do we use friction hitches for in climbing and mountaineering? The most common use of a friction hitch is backing up a rappel. Now this is what I use a friction hitch for the most, and the reason that you have to use a friction hitch in this situation is generally when we're rappelling on two strands of rope. Now there aren't really any mechanical devices out there that can work to back up a rappel in the same way. If you're using an assisted braking device such as a gree or a neox, for example, to rappel down, then you might not necessarily feel the need to use a backup friction hitch on that rappel. However, if you're using a plate style device like a Petzl Reverso, for example, then it's a really good idea to use a friction hitch as a backup. There are a bunch of other situations that we might use friction hitches as well. So in a hauling system, so for example during crevasse rescue, we might use friction hitches, or if you're hauling somebody on a multi-pitch climb. We might also use friction hitches for climbing up a rope, and we might also use friction hitches for attaching to the middle of the rope. So for example, if we're traversing a glacier, we might have people attached to the middle of the rope using a friction hitch. Another situation that you might need a friction hitch is passing a knot when you're rappelling. Why might you need to pass a knot? You might have a damaged section of rope, or you might have a fixed rope that's going down and is attached to a re-belay and then goes down to another belay. And in that situation, we need a friction hitch that we can release under load. So those are the main situations that we might use a friction hitch, and there's probably a bunch of other small situations as well that we might use a friction hitch. A key takeaway though is to think about whether a friction hitch is releasable under load or not. If it's not releasable under load, it could be useful in certain situations, but if it is releasable under load, it might not be useful in that situation, but it could be useful in a different situation. For example, using a friction hitch that isn't releasable to back up a rappel can cause you more problems than using a backup hitch that is releasable. Another example is using a releasable friction hitch to climb up a rope could cause you issues, because if you accidentally grab hold of that friction hitch and pull down on it, then it will release and it will start coming down towards you. So there's just two different examples of how we use friction hitches in different ways, depending whether they're releasable or non-releasable. Some other considerations when it comes to climbing and mountaineering is we might be wearing gloves. Now gloves make it notoriously more difficult to tie knots and hitches, so we want knots and hitches that we can use with gloves on. Now we don't want to have to take our gloves off to be able to fiddle something around the rope. We want to be able to do it with our gloves on ideally. These friction hitches need to be easily recognized. Now if you go down the sort of deep dark hole of all these different more fancy specialist hitches within like arborist use, for example, you will find hitches that are very difficult to verify whether they've been tied correctly. Now that's not an issue if everybody's level is super high, but if you're out with people, I would suggest that they probably are only going to be familiar with about 3 different hitches if they've had some kind of formal training. We also need to consider that friction hitches need to work when ropes are icy or covered in snow or when they're wet, because these are scenarios where we might be having to deal with a rescue situation, for example if it starts raining on a multi-pitch climb. So we need to understand how these friction hitches work in different situations and do our own tests and understand how our gear works specifically when it's wet, for example. It could also be good if the friction hitch cord that we're using is useful for other things. So for example, can our friction hitch loop be used as an alpine runner? Can we dismantle that friction hitch cord and use it as an anchor in a real emergency? And also, do we have other items with us that we can use as a backup hitch if needs be? For example, do you have your chalk bag loop made of some prusik hitch cord, or do you just have it made out of some like nylon webbing with a plastic buckle? All these things are worth considering when we're choosing our hitch cord and also when we're tying different hitches and learning about this kind of stuff. Over the last couple of decades, devices like this have become more and more popular. This is the Searle Micro Traction, and it's a mechanical device that's used in rescue situations, for example in crevasse rescue. Now these are really good. They've got an integrated pulley in there and they've got teeth on the device, but the teeth that are in here aren't particularly friendly to the outside of your rope. And what does that actually mean? Now, if it's used statically, that's not an issue. It's not going to create any issues with the rope, but any kind of dynamic load that goes through this could really strip the sheath off that rope. The other thing is these are quite heavy, and if you compare these to a hitch cord or a piece of prusik cord that you use for tying a friction hitch, then you can actually save quite a lot of weight in leaving these things behind and just using your hitch cord instead. That's just something to consider if you're doing bigger mountains where you're heading out onto a short section of glacier where you need some crevasse rescue equipment, but you don't necessarily need to be lugging this the whole way to the start of the route, all the way up the route, and then onto that short bit of glacier where you don't really feel like you actually need to have this with you just for that. This also doesn't work to back up a rappel, so this is something that you bring alongside your prusik loops or your hitch cord so that you can actually perform a rescue. It doesn't replace using prusik loops or prusik hitch cord. Okay, so you just heard me say friction hitch cord and then a prusik loop as well. Now we use different language to describe these types of things, and some of them are kind of more like slang use of the word, like prusik loop for example is something that we use in the UK to describe a loop of cord that's used to tie a prusik hitch around a rope. A prusik loop could also tie an Autoblock, which isn't a prusik, but it is a friction hitch. But there's also this style of hitch cord, which is an eye-to-eye hitch cord. So it has a sewn loop in each end like this, and we wrap this cord around the rope, create our friction hitch, and that's what we're going to use instead of it being in a loop like this. Now there's pros and cons of using both, but what you will find is that you will predominantly see climbers using a loop of cord like this, whether it's sewn closed and actually rated for a certain rating, or whether it's actually made out of a piece of cord that you've then tied in a knot to make a loop. The reason that people predominantly use these loops is that you can create the 3 most common friction hitches out of a loop much more easily than you can out of a friction hitch cord. But these do have a small place within climbing and mountaineering, in my opinion, and we're going to talk about these later on in this video. So here's 2 different examples of some prusik loops. This is the BL Jammy, and this is a 60cm version, and this is actually my go-to friction hitch cord loop. Now this is a 6mm nylon piece of accessory cord that's been tied with a double fisherman's to make a loop, and this is actually slightly shorter. It's about 40cm loop instead of this, which is about 60. Now this is about 5mm cord and this is about 6mm cord. So we're already starting to see some differences in thickness, but also the material that's being used as well. So let's dive into like the pros and cons of different lengths, different materials, and whether or not tying your prusik hitches is the best way, or whether or not it's better to just get one of these pre-made things like a BL jammy or a Sterling hollow block, for example. So nylon like this is very cheap, it's very easy to get hold of, you'll be able to find it in every single climbing shop that you go to. It's strong enough for what we need it to be used for, and that is only really ever going to be using our body weight plus whatever equipment that we're carrying. So we don't need something that's going to be extra strong. So nylon is sufficient for most people. And I would say that most people kind of go ahead, they buy some accessory cord and they form a loop with double fishmans like this. And this is completely fine for prusik loops in most situations. These knots though, they do tend to get quite heavily loaded and they can be quite difficult to undo, but it is possible to undo them. And that could be quite useful if we wanted to use this to create an anchor, for example. So let's say you're ice climbing and you get down and you're like, oh, now I need to do another rappel and I need to make an Autoblock. You could actually, make an Autoblock out of this and then leave this behind. And it's just a neat thing that you can actually do with this style of friction hitch loop. However, the plus sides with a pre-sewn loop like this is that it's rated to 22 kilonewtons. So that means that you could actually use it as an alpine runner as well. You could also put it over a spike and use it as a runner as well and have no issues or worries about the strength. These have been specifically designed to be used for friction hitches. So the material that they're made out of is a good material that grips well to the sheath of a rope, and it's also heat resistant to a certain degree, and it's nice and supple as well, which is a good thing when it comes to tying friction hitches. The more supple the material is, the more it spreads out over the sheath of the rope, and then it's going to give you more grip on that rope. A 6mm nylon cord like this is quite stiff actually, and it's quite tricky to tie, and it doesn't necessarily grip to the rope as well as something like that BL jammy. You can, however, soften up this cord quite easily, and I'll show you a neat little trick for how you can soften up some 6mm cord and, still end up with something that's usable. So this softer version of this prusik loop, I've actually pulled out one of the strands of the core of the rope. You can do that very easily by just cutting the cord, locating one of the strands of rope like that. You grab that one and you're going to be just pulling that out of there. And as long as it isn't sealed at the other end by heat, then you should be able to pull that one out. And it's just a nice way that you can actually soften up this cord and make it a little bit more usable as a friction hitch. So this is another style of hitch cord that you can buy. This is a Sterling hollow block 2. Now these aren't actually that easy to find over in Europe. They're not rated in the same way that the BL jammy is, for example, but it has got a sewn bar tab in here. These things are nice and soft. They're easy to tie friction hitches with. They're also made of aramid, and that's very heat resistant, which is a good material to be using when you're sliding it down a rope, for example, when you're backing up a rappel. A material that wouldn't be particularly good to use as a friction hitch, but you might be able to use it in a pinch, and you certainly want to test it out as to whether it works before you kind of trust it, is Dyneema. So we use Dyneema quite a lot for alpine runners, for example, but it's very slippery and it doesn't grip that well to a climbing rope, so it's not a particularly good material to be using for a backup friction hitch. And also it's not particularly heat resistant as well, so it can get melted quite easily if you're using it on a backup for a rappel. Okay, so what kind of thickness does the hitch cord need to be in order to work on the rope in a good way? Now, ideally the hitch cord is half the thickness of the rope. Now that's just a rule of thumb, but actually you could get away with it being half the thickness plus 1mm if you're working on a single strand. The thinner it is, the less strong the cord is going to be, so you want to have as thick a cord as possible that's still going to work on that rope. So around about 5-6mm generally works best for like a single rated rope, and you might want to consider having something more like a 4mm hitch cord if you're working with really thin ropes like a Petzl radline, for example. If you're using one of these eye-to-eye style hitch cords though, then you could get away with something that's more like 8mm. This is actually a tendon timber prusik cord. It's 8mm in thickness and it's rated for 22 kilonewtons. if doubled up like this. So talking about the length of the loop that you might want for your hitch cord loop, then I'd say probably 40 centimeters or 35 centimeters is about the minimum that you would want. But ideally, no more than like 60 centimeters. If you have something that's longer than 60 centimeters, then it's going to take a long time to do all the wraps around it. But what you can always do is shorten up a 60 centimeter hitch cord loop as well. So that actually means that you don't have to do as many wraps necessarily. And that's an option that you have with a longer one, but you don't have with a shorter one. You can't make a shorter one longer. Just let the cat in. So how strong does your prusik loop need to actually be? Now, a loop like this is going to be pretty strong. It's definitely going to be strong enough to hold our weight. And we don't need a huge margin of safety when it comes to prusik hitches, but we always need to remember that when we're using a prusik hitch, we have some kind of backup to it. So if we're ascending a rope, then we're going to be using like a clove hitch on our harness to back up our friction hitch. So there's never going to be all your weight and all your eggs in one basket of using just a prusik loop around the rope. There always needs to be something else that's backing it up, or it's used in conjunction with something else so that it's not the only thing that's holding that system. For me though, certainly when I'm guiding, I like to have a fully rated prusik loop like this, which is the BL Jammy. This is the 60 centimeter version. I'm generally carrying 2 of these, and also my chalk bag belt is made out of cord. I'll have some spare cord in the bag. I'll have various other things that I could potentially use as prusik loops or hitch cord as well. Now, could you use a boot lace as a prusik hitch? Well, yeah, you probably could, as long as it's strong enough, but you only would know that by testing it out. So if you want to know that, then test it out and see if it works. You can also use the end of the rope to create a friction hitch as well, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on in the video, but this could be a really interesting thing if you have to climb back up the rope and you've just dropped your prusik loop, for example. So let's get stuck into talking about some of the friction hitches that we use for climbing and mountaineering and some of their considerations. But before we do that, I wanted to tell you about a new online climbing course that I've created. I've just released my first online course, which is a foundational course for alpine climbing. Now, if you're watching this video a few years down the line, there might also be a whole bunch of other courses that are actually on that platform. So I'm going to leave a link down below to those courses and you can go and check them out. And I've also left a limited time discount code which you can use to sign up to that first course with 25 euros off. So for example, if you're coming from a rock climbing background and you want to get started with alpine climbing in the Alps, then you kind of need to know about the clothing that we use and other equipment, the weather, how we use huts, all that kind of stuff. So I created this course which is super fun and easy going, and you can sign up to it at any time during the year and get stuck in and started with alpine climbing. So check out the link below if you want to get started with alpine climbing. Okay, so let's look at some of the most common friction hitches that we use, and then we'll look at some slightly less common ones and some kind of like ones that you might use in an emergency. So the 3 most common hitches that I see and I use on a regular basis are the Autoblock, the prusik, and the Klemheist, in that order. The Autoblock is probably the most useful friction hitch because it's the one that you're going to be using when you're backing up your rappel, and that's more commonly used than using the prusik knot or the Klemheist because those are generally more for rescue situations. And we kind of hope that we never have to do rescue situations. We just kind of need to know how to do them in case we need to do it. So the Autoblock in the UK is known as a French prusik, and in France it's known as a machard. Now, I quite like the term Autoblock because it's used to auto-block your belay device when you're rappelling. That's the most useful situation that you're going to be using it in. So I'd quite like to encourage people to refer to it as the Autoblock because that's kind of the best name for it in English. To tie the Autoblock, what we're going to do is we're going to take this bar tab and we're going to offset it so we've got a little bit of a loop like this at the top. So this isn't kind of sat like this, we've got a nice loop like that. And we're going to wrap this around the rope going upwards. So we're going to wrap it around, making sure it's nice and neat and those strands aren't kind of crossing over themselves at any point. I'm going to wrap around a few times like that. and the number of wraps that we do will be dependent on a number of factors. Let's talk about that now, but this is how we finish it off, just by clipping those two ends together. And what we're really looking for to start with, a good baseline, is having equal distance here, here, and here. And if that doesn't work because it's not gripping, then we add a wrap. And if it's too grippy, then we take a wrap away. And we can only understand whether it's working or not by testing it. So test it out at home, test it on a single strand, test it on a double strand, and try and figure out how many wraps work for you, your prusik loop, the ropes that you're using, and the weight of your body weight plus your equipment. Something else that we can do to gain more friction from this is by adding a few twists into one of these legs of the loop as well, and that just kind of like cinches it down a little bit tighter as well. If we're pulling downwards like this, then we want to kind of twist it around a little bit so that both of the legs of the hitch are being equally loaded. So what I mean by that is, if it was kind of like this, then you're only loading kind of one side, then it's not going to grip until it sort of twists around and then gets that purchase as they both become equally loaded. Now, the Autoblock is the hitch out of the three main hitches that we use in climbing and mountaineering that has the least amount of holding power on the rope. But because it has the least amount of holding power, it's the easiest to release. Now, this is a great tool for using when you're rappelling because you can easily release it under load. And because it's quite a short friction hitch as well, it sits underneath a belay device on a short rappel extension really neatly. So in my opinion, this is the best friction hitch to be using underneath your belay device with a rappel extension. However, this wouldn't be a particularly good hitch to use to climb up a rope, for example, because if we're climbing up a rope and we accidentally grab on top of this hitch, it's going to slide back down and we're going to come back down to our backup, and that's just going to cause us extra issues. But it could be quite good to use on your belay loop, for example, and then you have a prusik hitch above, and that just makes it a little bit easier to kind of set up a system to go up, because it's easier to unload. It's also a little bit easier to pull rope through it as well. Just to prove that I can release it under load, I'm fully loading this and I can just pull down on the top of this hitch and it's coming down. We obviously never just use friction hitches to go down on the rope. It's only ever as a backup to our belay device. But there are some situations where you want a friction hitch that you can kind of slide down the rope a little bit to pass a knot, for example. So the next most useful hitch is the prusik hitch, and to form a prusik hitch, all we're going to do is take that same bar tab, or if it's knots, because you have a prusik loop that has knots in it, you would get those away to the side so you have a little loop here. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of spread out the loop like this, and we're going to pass that bar tab through the rope. Okay, once, twice, 3 times, and then we're going to pull that bar tab side of it, and it's probably going to end up being a little bit messy like that, and everything's going to be kind of a little bit kind of crossed up. And what we're going to do is we're just going to dress it quickly like that. Should be pretty easy to do. We're just going to pull those strands. So now what we have is the bar tab is in the middle of the friction hitch, and then this little tab here is going to the outside. Now this is a much better friction hitch to use for ascending a rope, especially as your foot loop above, because it's not going to get accidentally loaded if you kind of pull down on it with your hand whilst it's under load. And also it bites onto the rope really well. It works on a single strand and a double strand, as does the Autoblock as well. But because this friction hitch uses less cord, then we might want to actually shorten it up to be able to use it. So we can do that simply by just tying an overhand knot in here. And then we can either girth hitch a sling around here to use as our foot loop, for example, like so. That would be how I would set up my foot loop on there. and I'm not having to use this carabiner, and I can then use this carabiner to redirect the rope through to make a kind of pulley system off my harness if I'm using my reverso upside down, or if I'm using a micro traction, for example, down on my belay device. Then I can use this to redirect the rope through, I can slide this up, all that kind of stuff. So this is definitely a setup that's worth kind of getting used to and practicing a little bit at home. I'm not going to dive into that setup in this video because that would just make it way too long. It is worth noting that you can also create the prusik with an eye-to-eye friction hitch cord as well. It looks very similar, but you just have the two eyelets on the inside of the knot like that. And one thing that is worth talking about with this is once this hitch has been loaded and we want to kind of release it, what we can do is hold these two strands here and use our thumb on this little piece that crosses over them, and that's just a way that we can unlock the hitch a little bit so we can then slide it back up again. So it's been loaded like this, feet off the ground, and then I'm just going to slide that one open, and it's going to make it easier to slide that friction hitch around. One thing that's also worth noting about the prusik is if I'm holding down on the top of it as I try and load it, it's not going to engage. So I do need to have it loaded first before I like touch the top of it and like grabbing hold of the rope to like pull myself up into a better position to stand in it, for example. But because it doesn't unload basically at all once it's loaded, that is useful in some situations. Other situations that it might be useful in as well is if you're hauling somebody like through some snow, for example, and they're in the middle of the rope. So this would be the knot that I would use to attach somebody into the middle of a rope as well if I wanted them to be able to move around, for example, to cross across crevasses. I would use the prusik to get them onto the middle of the rope. So the third most popular hitch that people use is the Klemheist, and I don't use it all that much, but it does have a place in certain situations. And the way we're going to tie that is we're going to start with that bar tab down at the bottom this time. We're going to wrap upwards with that free end. We're going to do maybe 4 or 5 wraps going up like so. And then what we're going to do is take that bar tab end and post it through that loop at the top and pull it down, and just kind of twist it around a little bit until it's nice and neat like that. And we're going to check that every strand is parallel and there's no crosses like that. Now this sits somewhere between the prusik and the Autoblock in terms of how it grips, and also in terms of how easy it is to unload. So it's not as easy to unload as the Autoblock, but it grips a little bit more than the Autoblock. The other benefit with this is you have a slightly longer tail as well. So this might be quite useful in situations, for example, if you are passing a knot on this rope where you have your belay device up here and I want to move the belay device underneath that knot. Having a slightly longer tail means that I can basically load that knot up whilst being able to get my belay device off. Not having that length there, you might have to add in something else to be able to achieve that, but something to play around with. The other thing to consider with the Klemheist is it's a single direction knot, so you can only pull down in this way, you can't pull up in that direction, whereas the Autoblock and the prusik are both multi-directional prusik, so they can be pulled in both directions and they work in both directions. The Autoblock just needs a little bit of dressing to be able to do that, but that's something you've got to consider about the Klemheist, is it only works in one direction. So let's talk about a few more kind of like specialist hitches that you can create with a hitch cord that you can't create with a prusik loop. Now, whether or not any of these are actually useful in climbing is, I'll let you kind of decide that. I personally think that you can do everything that you need to do with those 3 hitches that I've just mentioned. You don't need to go down the road of learning how to do these kind of hitches, but they can make certain things slightly easier. And in some ways, they are easier to unload and do certain things as well. So we'll talk a little bit about a couple of these different hitches and how they might fit in with climbing. So the first hitch that's worth talking about is the Swabish hitch, and this is actually very similar to a prusik hitch in kind of how it looks, but it's offset, so it's a single direction hitch. What we're going to do is start with 5 wraps like this, and then we're going to cross over like this, over that part of the hitch. We're going to wrap around the back like this, and then down through there. So the Swabish hitch works in a single direction like this. It's not going to work in this direction, it's just going to slide. So it works in a single direction like this, and it grips the rope very, very well, but it is also easy to release as well. So there is some benefits there, that it does grip the rope well, but it is also easy to release as well. So in that ways, it could also be a replacement for something like the Autoblock, in that you can use it to back up your rappel, but it's going to grip much better in that situation. So the next hitch that I think is really worth learning how it works and how you can also make different mistakes with it as well is the VT, which is the Valdestan-Tresse. And this knot is actually really nice because it grips onto the rope really well, and it's also very easy to unload as well. Now, there are ways that you can make mistakes when you're tying this knot, as with a lot of the other more complicated knots that I'm not going to talk about in this video. And the reason that I'm not going to show you how to tie this is I think there's actually some really good demos out there, and I've actually linked a really good video down in the description of how to tie this knot. It does require that you cross the strands of the rope in the correct order to create it, and for me that does create some complications. If I'm trying to do that when I'm a bit stressed or tired and I'm out in the mountains with gloves on, figuring out how to do this and making sure that I'm doing it well, then that's not really very good use of my brain power, and it's also kind of quite unfair to ask my friend to kind of buddy check that I've tied this hitch correctly. So if you're going to use these type of hitches and you're going to start like employing them in your techniques that you actually take into the mountains, then you just need to make sure that you understand how they work, you've tested them, and you know that you're tying it perfectly each time. Relying on a friction hitch and then it's sliding is really not fun, because then you just kind of like, you know, and you sort of end up having to grab hold of the rope and all this kind of stuff. So my advice really is stick to those key 3 hitches that we spoke about before, and then if you want to employ these type of hitches into your climbing and mountaineering, then really dive deep into them. Make sure you're very happy to tie them without anybody like buddy checking you as well, and you know when and where you're going to be employing these hitches into your system. I've also left a link down below to a really in-depth page which has got loads of other hitches that you can learn as well if you really want to nerd out on this kind of stuff. I think it is really interesting, like just learning these techniques. Like a lot of people just enjoy learning these techniques, and I totally agree with that. Like I really enjoyed learning new techniques myself. But yeah, it's always that balancing act of learning too much and kind of having to like choose which tool to use versus having like a solid set of tools that you know how they work each time and just relying on those. The other thing, if I were to show you how to tie a Valdestan-Tresse and tell you all the different ways that you can get it wrong, that'd probably take up another like 5, possibly even 10 minutes of this video. And I think by this point, people have had a lot of good information, but there's one final hitch I think would be really interesting. So here's the final hitch that I mentioned before in this video, and I think it is interesting to learn how to tie. So this is the Blake's hitch, and this is a hitch that you can tie by using the rope itself to be able to get friction on that rope. Now, there are some situations that I can think of within climbing and mountaineering that this might actually be quite useful. For example, in that kind of really terrible situation where you've rappelled down a rope, you've not managed to get to the ground, or you've not managed to get to the belay and you need to come back up again, you go to reach back and get your friction hitch off the back of the harness and you drop it, and you end up without having any way that you can climb back up the rope, you do need a way that you can at least stand up on that loaded rope so you can like move your belay device around if you've got like a reverso style belay device, so you can then use that to kind of climb back up the rope. So knowing how to tie one of these for those kind of like really bad situations that very, very rarely happen could be really worthwhile. This is the load strand of the rope, and what we're going to do is we're going to take the tail of the rope and we're going to take about like a forearm's worth of rope, and we're going to wrap it around the rope 4 times like that. So you end up with 4 strands like this. And then all we're going to do here is we're going to cross over like this, and then we're going to go behind the load strand here and then up through those 2 loops like that and pull it nice and tight around the rope. Now, what we don't want is obviously this tail coming back out again, so we could also tie a very short, easy, small stopper knot with like an overhand, and that just stops it from kind of coming back out of here. And that's called a Blake's hitch, and it is something that we don't use that much within climbing and mountaineering for sure, but it is definitely worth knowing. This is something that they use in like tree climbing quite often, and it actually was discovered in the 1980s and really became popular in the 1990s. So this isn't some kind of technique that's been around for like 40, 50, 60 years. This is actually a fairly new technique that was discovered not that long ago, really, in the grand scheme of things. So with this, you could then also tie like a loop down here, for example, and then you could use that loop as your foot loop to stand up in to release the tension off here, so then you can then move your belay device around. So there are a few things that you can do then with the end of the rope if you don't have any other equipment with you. So yeah, a worthwhile thing to practice and know how to do. So as with all videos, there has to be some kind of end point, and we're going to wrap up this topic here for my deep dive. We don't need to go any deeper into other friction hitches. I don't think that's necessary for most people. But hopefully you found that video really interesting. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. That's really going to help me to spread this video out so more and more people can see it. If you haven't subscribed already, then please go down there and do that. It's completely free, and it just means that you won't miss any of my future videos. But one final thought and one final point about all of this kind of stuff is make sure that you've tested out these systems at home and you're very familiar with how they work in a safe environment. So do what I literally did here and attach a rope to something and practice making these hitches, practice trying to unload them, practice tying them with gloves on, all these different things. See how they work if they're just backing up a belay device or if they've got your full weight. Try different thicknesses. How thick is too thick? Do you need to remove that strand from your 6mm cord to make it a bit softer? Just practice and try out all this kind of stuff at home and make your own decisions about what works. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time. Cheers, guys.